Assalamu alaikum. Thank you all for joining us for another evening of the Frames conversation. Inshallah, tonight we'll have Dr. Hadia Mubarak joining us, and we'll be discussing her recently released book, Rebellious Wives Neglectful Husbands, Controversies in Modern Quranic Commentaries. Inshallah, you can join our ALIM book club next Wednesday by going to alimprogram.com/book-club, and you can join the book club discussion on this book that will be held with Ustadh Ubaydullah Evans. I'll start by introducing Dr. Hadia, and inshallah we can get right into the conversation. Dr. Hadia Mubarak is an ALIM guest scholar and associate professor of religion at Queen's University of Charlotte. She has completed her PhD in Islamic Studies from Georgetown University, where she specialized in modern and classical Quranic exegesis, Islamic feminism, and gender reform in the modern Muslim world. And Dr. Hadia is also an alumni. So, inshallah, I'll have Ustadh Ubaydullah and Dr. Hadia here, and we can get started.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Ustadh Ubaydullah. I'm very happy to be sharing this stage with you again, and I apologize to everyone for technical difficulties. We were not.
No, and I want to second that apology. I had also some technical difficulties getting on, but mashallah, we're here now. You know, no time like the present. How have you been? How's your family?
Alhamdulillah, doing well. My kids are older now; they're 14 and 11. So at the time I was doing my PhD, I actually had my first child while I was during my, course study during my doctorate degree, and then my second one as I was finishing my comps. So for those of you out there who are mothers or fathers doing your degrees, I encourage you to keep going. Inshallah, it is possible.
Alhamdulillah, I have some notification popping up on my screen. Yes, and how are things there in Charlotte? I understand that you're also doing some public intellectual work at the masjid.
Alhamdulillah, yeah. So I was at the masjid right before coming here at the Muslim Community Center of Charlotte, MCC. And so, I teach youth at the masjid, and I really enjoy engaging with the youth. They are our future. They're the next generation to, and I think it's just so important for them to, have a place where they can talk about their questions or concerns, and also to just be able to identify with others who grew up in America, especially for those like me who are descendants of immigrants, to have a place where they can navigate their Muslim American identity. And I know that's what ALIM is all about, about trying to cultivate that sense of identity so people don't feel this disconnect with the very place that we are trying to build and grow and be a part of, which is the United States of America, right? I mean, this is ours, and we have to take care of it and appreciate it for what it is.
MashaAllah, Allah yubarak feek. There's a lot to talk about this evening. I want to talk about your book, but before talking about this book that is very provocatively titled, I must say, it's one of those titles that when you see it, you're not going to just go past that. You're definitely grabbing for a book entitled Rebellious Wives Neglectful Husbands. Some of us might grab it expecting something other than what we're going to find. Some of it we might grab it thinking, okay, this is like a self-help book or something of that nature. It's actually a research book. It's an intellectual tour de force looking at classical and contemporary tafsir and the way that personal law and also exegesis around these ayat of the Quran have been treated in these sources. Can you tell me a little bit about the genesis of your interest in tafsir broadly, and then more specifically, the idea to write this book? And just give me 1 second. My kids are making so much noise.
No worries.
My wife is traveling to New York to visit her grandmother, who inshallah will be 101 in July.
Mashallah.
And I'm here just with the kids all alone. My eldest actually is in Morocco studying Arabic.
Oh, mashallah.
And so I just have the two small kids. And I don't even have like my eldest daughter, who's like kind of like a good intermediary between the parents and the kids. I'm all alone on this one. So,
mashallah, mashallah. You're a good father. Okay, we'll wait for Ustadh Ubaydullah.
What did I say?
We'll wait for Ustadh Ubaydullah to get on. And also, Sister Aisha, if we can, will we be able to hear the questions from our audience? I just want to make sure we have an opportunity to engage with questions they may have.
Yes, returning to this enriching conversation. So yeah, your interest in tafsir broadly, and the genesis of this book.
Yeah. So really it began, I would say it began when I was doing my master's degree at Georgetown University. I was doing a master's degree in contemporary Arab studies. Initially, I thought my focus was going to be, comparative politics of the Middle East. Mm-hmm. I started in 2003, 2 years after 9/11. I tell my students when I did undergrad, I never thought I was going to go into academia, and especially not in religious studies. I always wanted to be a journalist, and but 9/11 happened while I was in undergrad, and I was at Florida State University, very large university. I was very active in the MSA, and really, I mean, that experience requires a whole nother book to just talk about what that experience was like. But for the first time, I felt like I needed to answer questions that I was not equipped to answer, and so I went to do this degree in Middle East Studies. I thought it can help me understand everything a lot better and answer questions. And I thought it could be useful for my degree in journalism. I wanted to still be a journalist. Well, then, of course, as fate has it, while I was doing my degree, I took a class in tafsir. I took a class in tafsir with Dr. Barbara Stowasser, who wrote one of the first books. In fact, I probably have it here. I'm going to actually see if I can grab it from under my other books without them all falling on me here. Okay, so without causing a trouble. So it's this book right here, Women in the Quran, Traditions and Interpretation. So she was my first mentor in tafsir. She was German, and she actually passed away while I was doing my doctoral studies.
Yeah, you wrote a very moving testimony to her in the introduction of your book.
Yes, yeah, and I think she was my mentor. At the end of the day, and some of the questions that got me thinking about these issues, she really prompted me to think about. But when I was first in her class as a graduate student, was reading tafsir of verse 434. That was one of the ayat that we delved into. We read medieval and modern mufassirin, and of course, as a Muslim who grew up familiar with the Muslim tradition, but not that familiar with the Muslim tradition, I found myself really surprised with what I found. I just want to make sure, is my connection okay? Because I see, Ustadh Ubaydullah, you're a little bit glitchy on my end. I want to make sure that everyone can see me and hear me.
You're glitchy on my end well. You're glitchy a little bit on that. I think now I'm through clearly.
Okay. So am I glitching on my end here as well? Let me see.
No, I can see and hear you clearly.
Okay. I am switching Wi-Fi connections really quick. So if you can just give me 1 second while I switch. Okay. Is this any clearer right now?
Okay. Yeah, it's good. It's fine.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to mention, I was, as a graduate student sitting in her classes, and, was just really surprised by some of the misogyny, to be very honest, that I read.
Well, let's be honest.
In the medieval exegetical tradition. And I was like, wait a second, how do I reconcile this? How do I reconcile what I'm reading with what I believe is divine intent? What is the authorial intent? What is the divine intent of this verse? And how are mufassirin or exegetes coming with these sort of interpretations they're coming with? And that led me on a very long journey. So my first piece on verse 434 was a journal article called Breaking the Interpretive Monopoly, a rereading kind of this verse, in which I'm engaging primarily with medieval mufassirin and looking primarily at qiwama, and also at qiwama. And, for those of you who are maybe not familiar with this term, It's really interpreted in a variety of ways, one of which is either kind of upholding male authority, or on the other end of the spectrum, it's actually upholding male responsibility towards wives. And so there are different ways to read this word qawamun. And so for very deliberate reasons, I do not translate it in the book itself. But one of the questions that Dr. Stowasser kind of prompted me to think about is, what impact does modernity make on this genre of tafsir when it comes to the question of women and gender? When we look at verses related to women and gender, the central question I'm examining in this book is, does modernity impact the way mufassirin are approaching these verses? So on one hand, the methods that they bring forth, as well as the interpretation itself. Like, are they bringing forth new insights on the meaning of these verses? So what I find, and I'm kind of, jumping ahead, what I do find is that, modern mufassirin reflect a gender conscious hermeneutic, I call it, that is absent from medieval mufassirin. They're very much recognizing the theoretical stock that these questions have for their societies. And that is because of the discourses generated by the experience of colonialism and thereafter the modern nation state, by which the question of women becomes sort of the litmus status, the litmus test by which we assess Islam. Is Islam compatible with modernity? Well, to answer this question, how does Islam treat women? What does Islam say about women? What does Islam say about things like polygyny, segregation, women in the workforce, a whole host of issues? And you find Muslim intellectuals responding in a number of ways to this dilemma, if you will, to this. It's more than just a theoretical challenge. It becomes this epistemological challenge because of the implication of how we answer that question. And so you find among Muslim intellectuals in specific a variety of ways. And I look at 4 mufassirin in specific. 2 of them are co-authors of one tafsir al-Manar. And I find that in many ways, their Quranic commentaries are a dialectic with contemporaneous debates happening in their societies. They're not simply engaging with the Quranic text, but they are also interpreting the Quran through the lens of broader discourses happening in their societies. And I argue that each one of these mufassirin is sort of engaging with a specific discourse, or responding to a specific, maybe responding to a specific segment of the society.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think some people are surprised to learn that so much extraneous, when people are, when you pick up a tafsir or a work of exegesis, like, let's start at the beginning, Jalalain, it seems to be a very simple, esoteric work. I'm just looking at the words, analyzing them on the basis of their kind of elocutionary force, what these words mean. And maybe poetry is cited, maybe a hadith of the Prophet alayhi salam are cited, and it seems quite simple. But the deeper one delves into the exegetical literature, you find that literature is always reflective of debates, questions, cultural trends, societal trends, ethnic norms, etc., that almost imperceptibly, of course, if one has the lens of color, you can see it, almost imperceptibly, these red will become, plain normative understanding of the Quran. Okay?
Ustadh Ubaydullah, I don't know if it's, am I glitching, because it glitched again, and I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me. So I don't know if it's my end. Can you hear me okay, or am I glitching? So I am unable to hear you very clearly. Let me see if I can get my kids to maybe make sure that they're off the Wi-Fi.
Ustadh Ubaydullah was breaking up a little for me. I can hear you clearly, Dr.
Okay,
Hadia.
time.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much. So Ustad Ubaydullah, I am so sorry because I could not hear the last thing you said. Did we lose Dr. Ubaydullah, Ustad Ubaydullah?
Yes, I think he just left the stream. He'll probably be coming back.
Okay, no worries because he was cutting up. Okay, I'm just telling my kids to get the Wi-Fi. So I don't know what the last question was referring to, but just to kind of keep our audience engaged, I will point out that I guess one thing I will say, maybe can repeat this briefly for Ustad Ubaydullah when he comes in, is that I'm looking at 4 modern mufassirin and comparing them to significant. There's Ustad Ubaydullah. I'm comparing these 4 significant Sunni commentaries in the 20th century to significant medieval Sunni commentaries. Of course, one question that I've been asked is, why am I not engaging with Shia tafsir? I think Shia tafsir is very important. I think feminist, you could say feminist exegesis, although we don't have a feminist tafsir work. I think those commentaries that exist are also important to engage with. But I am interested in the scholarly genre of tafsir in the form of Quranic commentaries. And that is why I precisely, kind of confine my study to medieval modern tafsir, because I situate these tafsir not only in their intellectual context, but also in their not only in their historical context, but also in their intellectual context. And I look at the development of the genre. And I believe that when it comes to trying to understand the source of some patriarchy in this tradition, it is impossible to discern that without understanding the intellectual development of this genre, in which exegetes are building upon one another and engaging with each other in order to establish their authority in this tradition. And by doing so, they sometimes inadvertently repeat patriarchal interpretations, just to be very blunt, right?
No. When you say patriarchal interpretations, what exactly do you mean by that? What because of course that has become a term that is almost regarded as an anathema by many. If you use the term, some men will feel accused, charged. I know you're using it as a scholar and a historian, and perhaps someone that has very strong views about dismantling or about critiquing or I don't. But what do you mean by patriarchy when you say that?
Yeah. And I think that's a really good question. I mean, I mean, when I talk about patriarchal interpretations, I mean interpretations, and I don't necessarily mean misogynistic. I think that's a little bit another level. But what I mean by that are interpretations that entrench or uphold the male as the privileged sex of the two sexes, that entrench sort of male authority over and male privilege over females, whether physically or in terms of status or whatnot, and really just in interpretations. Again, then you have also androcentric interpretations that basically establish the male as a normative self, as a normative perspective against which the female is then measured, right? So you have both going on. And I was starting to go into this when we got cut off with Ustadh Ubaydullah. So just to kind of keep the audience engaged, one of the debates going on in Western scholarship, specifically on women and gender in the Quran, is, okay, what is the origin of textual androcentricism in the tradition? Like, where is it coming from? So you have like Esma Barlas and Amina Wadud who say, it's a function of the methods or failure to apply an intertextual method to reading the Quran. So they will say, the methods that Mufassirin used kind of lent themselves to these interpretations. And then you have scholars like Kisha Ali and Aisha Hidayatullah, who actually argue that patriarchy is inherent to the Quranic text, and it's not some sort of misreading of the text. You have Aisha Chowdhury, who wrote the book Domestic Violence and the Islamic Tradition, looking at 434, who says it's a function of medieval Mufassirin's cosmology, in which they kind of viewed the world as men, as sort of intermediaries between God and women, and this influenced the way they then read the Quran. Okay, so where do I stand on this question? And I would say that my findings show that, I mean, there's so much I can say about this. First of all, I want to make very clear that my findings show that this tradition is not by any means monolithically patriarchal, as many scholars have sort of dismissed it to be, right? And that's where I start off in my introduction, that there's been this indictment against tafsir, if you will, that tafsir has sort of been blamed as the source of misogyny, and therefore a lot of scholars, in rereading the Quran from an egalitarian lens or engaging with this question of women in the Quran, are dismissing the tradition, are dismissing specifically the tafsir tradition. And what I'm trying to do in this book is really bring women's studies and tafsir studies into conversation. I think that what I find is that we, in fact, have from the very early period interpretations that overturn or challenge some of the dominant interpretations that many of us are familiar with. So that's number one. But the second thing I would say is that if we understand the genre itself as being genealogical, in the sense that scholars are engaging with one another's works, they're building their authority through showing familiarity with its discursive history, the discursive history of this tafsir tradition, you have some things being inadvertently repeated. So I'm going to give you just an example of what I'm talking about. So in verse 200, so in verse 228 in Surah Al-Baqarah, you have this ayah where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَالْمُطَلَّقَاتُ يَتَرَبَّصْنَ بِأَنفُسِهِنَّ ثَلَاثَةَ قُرُوء, right? So the divorced women shall wait, and then concerning themselves, بِأَنفُسِهِنَّ, for 3 cycles. So you have Az-Zamakhshari saying, and that's of course not the whole ayah, but the first clause of it, who says, I believe he was early, let's see, he I believe was early 13th century or late 12th century. I have to double check that. I believe late 12th century, Al-Zamakhshari, who says that why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say in this ayah, bi anfusihinna? What is the wisdom in this? And he then proceeds to say, well, because the anfus of women are desirous of men. The nature or the spirit, that nafs, of course, can be translated in so many ways, as you all know. And anfus here is the plural of nafs. And so he says, why does God emphasize by saying bi anfusihinna? And so again, he says the nature of women, or the spirits of women, are desirous of men. And basically, they are now being told to restrain that natural impulse to want to remarry, and restrain that impulse, restrain that desire, and hold it back. And that is the reason that you have this extra subclause, if you will, bi anfusihinna, this phrase. So then you have, first of all, where does Az-Zamakhshari get this interpretation from? Like, what methodology does he base it on? And really, I mean, I think it would be fair to say it's quite a subjective interpretation, because there's nothing in our, there's no clear explicit evidence for this notion that women are desirous of men. In fact, Abdul, many centuries later, criticizes this and says, in fact, it's quite the opposite. Nonetheless, you have 2 very influential medieval commentaries repeating this interpretation verbatim. You have Al-Razi's Mafatih al-Ghayb, and you also have Al-Baydawi's Anwar al-Tanzil wa Asrar al-Ta'wil, also repeating this tafsir, or this opinion on women's anfus being desirous of men, and therefore they can hardly contain themselves for 3 cycles before remarrying. Just repeated verbatim. And there's a lot we can say about this. Like, well, why would they repeat this opinion? Why would they repeat a kind of subjective analysis, if you will, of women's spirits being desirous of men? Did they agree with this? Not necessarily. When a mufassir repeats an opinion, it does not necessarily acknowledge an endorsement of that opinion. But we have to again understand what's going on with this within this genre intellectually. So Az-Zamakhshari's tafsir al-Kashaf was seen as sort of the seminal tafsir that was used in the madrasas, and there were so many hawashi, glosses, if you will, or supra commentaries written on this important work. And so, yeah, at the same time, Az-Zamakhshari was a Mu'tazili theologically. But yet he was recognized for his linguistic insights. And so Al-Razi and Al-Baydawi are both trying to write a tafsir that would minimize the Mu'tazili or do away with the Mu'tazili ideas or leanings of Az-Zamakhshari's tafsir while also retaining the linguistic insights he brought forth. So this is one of the reasons why you find some interpretations being repeated, for example, which in my opinion, if we're to look at this tradition holistically, sort of entrenches some patriarchal opinions. But what I also want to make clear is that we find many instances in which these dominant opinions are also very much being challenged. Ustadh Ubaydullah, I don't know how much of this you were able to catch by any chance.
I want to keep the conversation moving. I tried to change places in my home where maybe I'm closer to the connection, because this is really good. And as you were speaking, I had a number of thoughts rushing to my mind, and I wanted to engage on some points, but I felt like every time I wanted to chime in, it was glitching. You weren't clear. I get the sense now, though, that the lines of the connection is stronger. Yes. And for the next 45 minutes, an hour, we should be able to converse much more freely. So if you could just recap what you were saying, and you gave an example from Zamakhshari about about the ayah 228.
Yes, yeah. Yes. So basically, I was just using this as an example, to talk about one of my findings. One of my incidental findings, actually, it wasn't even, I didn't write out the book trying to find out like where do patriarchal readings come from. But inadvertently, I find that one way of explaining how, if you're to look at the tradition holistically and you see this repetition of some subjective analysis regarding women and women's nature, if you will, the reason some of this is being repeated is not, in my opinion, has nothing to do with the cosmology of these mufassirin or even their a function of their methods, because in fact they're oftentimes even applying a different set of hermeneutics. Yet it has to do with understanding the tradition itself as genealogical, in the sense that there's a genealogy going on where they are engaging with each other's work to sometimes not necessarily even to endorse those opinions, but to establish their own authority within this tradition, right? And so my point in that example was to point out how Al-Razi, his Mafatih al-Ghayb, and then Al-Baydawi's Anwar al-Tanzil wa Asrar al-Ta'wil repeat verbatim this idea that from Az-Zamakhshari, that women's anfus are desirous of men, and almost to the point as if, they cannot even wait for 3 cycles before remarrying, right? Something as Az-Zamakhshari says is kind of, one can say, a subjective analysis.
I want to chime in here. So if this is where, and this, I'm not pushing back.
No, please.
But I'm interested in knowing how we differentiate between, okay, Zamakhshari offers what is clearly a subjective opinion. It's an act of eisegesis, right? He's reading a meaning into the text, and it comes from his own subjective, admittedly limited human understanding of reality. I guess my question becomes, how do we differentiate between that? And we have the right to say that's an impoverished view. That's that we can actually experientially say, no, that's not true. How do we distinguish between that and a system, right? A cosmology was the word that you used, that affords a diminished value to femininity or womanhood.
So is your question, how do we distinguish between the two? Is that
meaning? How do you meaning? And my thing is, if Zamakhshari had been female, and he said the same thing that I think is impoverished, I think is limited, and I think it can be categorically shown to be false, would that make it different?
Yeah, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And so what I wanted to say is, so, you know, so just the fact that Al-Baydawi and Al-Razi, Fakhruddin Al-Razi, are repeating this opinion does not mean they even agree with this opinion. But why? So why do they repeat it? They repeat it because if we understand this, again, the nature of this genre, where, for example, Al-Zamakhshari was seen as bringing forth these brilliant linguistic insights, but at the same time, he had these Mu'tazili theological leanings. So they were trying to, you know, retain some of these linguistic insights while doing away with the Mu'tazili leanings of his work, therefore, you know, engaging very much with those linguistic insights, and by repeating them, not necessarily even, you know, agreeing with them, but repeating some of these opinions inadvertently. And what I find is sort of entrenching certain ideas that I do not believe have a strong basis in this tradition. And why is this important? You know, why is this important? You know, there's so many other examples, you know, like Ibn Kathir, for example, even on the meaning of وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ. I think, you know, why, you know, as a woman who is clearly invested in gender egalitarianism and gender justice, why salvage the tafsir tradition? Why am I doing this, right? Why am I trying to bring women's studies and tafsir studies into conversation? Is because I think there are many, you know, that the tafsir tradition has been grossly misunderstood as being, you know, monolithic, as being sort of the static body of interpretations that are just being repeated over and over again, which is not the case at all. The tafsir tradition revolves a very pluralistic and evolving interpretation on women and gender. And when it comes to the question of where did they stand on a host of issues related to women, we find that even when medieval mufassirin perhaps upheld certain notions of male privilege, they were also very much concerned with women's welfare, with notions of justice. You know, for example, if you compare just medieval and modern mufassirin on the ayah on polygyny, you find that medieval mufassirin very much saw the central function of this verse, the central aim of this verse, as preserving justice for wives and for orphan females, for female orphans. And it was not even a question of trying to explain why polygyny existed, but rather why God restricted the practice of polygyny to 4 women. So whereas, you know, modern mufassirin, for example, are trying to explain why God allowed it to begin with, and very much, you know, I named the chapter, I think I titled it A New Rationalization for Polygyny, because they're trying to rationalize polygyny in the context in which they're living, in which, you know, there are all these critiques being heaped on Islam, and now they're trying to defend. So they have to kind of explain why Allah allowed for polygyny. For medieval exegetes, this was a non-issue. There was no need, there was no defensive posturing, if you will, and it was sort of, in fact, why did God limit or restrict this pre-existing institution? But what I found very interesting is that they did not find marriage or depict marriage as unconditionally good or divorce as unconditionally bad, because they recognized that there were certain ethical parameters around which marriage or married men and women were expected to live or observe. There were certain ethical parameters, and a failure to uphold those ethical and legal parameters could make a marriage not worthy of pursuing, you know. And when it comes to polygyny, for example, you know, you have someone like At-Tabari, I believe it was At-Tabari, you know, saying that if a man cannot uphold justice to even one wife, then it's better not to marry at all.
You know, Muhammad Fadl, Professor Dr. Muhammad Fadl, you know, he said, you know, he had an article that ran in the Zaytuna magazine, in the Seasons periodical, and he was talking about the principle of anti-domination in Islamic law, that Islamic law has an anti-domination kind of spirit that kind of runs through the law. But one thing that anti-domination requires is it requires a recognition of inherent differences in capacity, inherent differences in power, inherent differences in ability. And then the law will try to mitigate the would-be negative consequences of those inherent differences. And sometimes I find that when the focus is on establishing an egalitarian ethic, or when the focus is on establishing, a basis of equality, we sometimes we miss that anti-domination component of our, I guess, religious ethic, because we seem to be in the contemporary period, we seem to be so bent on establishing kind of the egalitarian ethic. And I find that when I'm reading classical Islamic law, I read in the law at Azhar, or I'm reading some opinions of mufassirun even, that could be read as unabashedly patriarchal. If you read further, it is often trying to encourage men with this additional spirit of responsibility, that I think an understanding of complete equity or complete equality, it might preclude the possibility of that chivalrous ethic.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you point that out. I think, to give a concrete example, one of the verses that I even get asked about by women sometimes in the modern period, because it's being used against them. It's literally, sad that verses get weaponized against women within a marriage sometimes. And, and that's a whole different discussion, because I think it's dangerous to blame human behavior on text. And I want to make that clear. Like, I'm engaging with the text, I'm engaging with interpretations of a text, but that does not mean that the text somehow becomes responsible for perversions out there and real abuse that happens in our communities, and that we have an onus, all of us, and a responsibility to stand up and speak against it. But I get asked, for example, about this meaning of women's degree. Men's degree over women, in verse 228. And really, one of the things I try to do in that chapter, it's the last chapter before the conclusion, is just to break down the legal context of this verse, which we often miss, that this is speaking of a very specific legal context in which a man, the husband, was the one who pronounced a divorce. So that the next ayah is speaking of a scenario in which the women may have initiated a divorce. But for 228, it's when the husband has pronounced a divorce, at-talaq, and now you have this waiting period in which this divorcee is waiting for the husband to, either revoke the divorce, the haqq al-raj'a, which is clearly established in this verse, وَبُعُولَتُهُنَّ أَحَقُّ بِرَدِّهِنَّ إِنْ أَرَادُوا إِصْلَاحًا. If they desire reconciliation, the husbands have the right, the greater right to take them back. And the woman's responsibility here is not to conceal whether or not she's pregnant or whether she's menstruating. And I will point out that, even medieval mufassirin said it's her testimony that determines when her cycle has ended. If the women believe her that her cycle has ended, her testimony is not to be second guessed if she's believed by the women. And I thought, okay, that's quite interesting. You have, even, for example, regarding the meaning of men's degree here, commentaries as early as At-Tabari from the 10th Century, quoting the Prophet's own cousin, the Prophet, peace be upon him's cousin, Abdullah ibn Abbas, radiallahu anhu, who was, one of the premier authorities on Quranic interpretation, who says this is men's responsibility to pardon the wife from some of her legal responsibilities, while
that's the way I was taught the ayah.
Yeah, while fulfilling all of his responsibilities to her, right? That this is being magnanimous, as you were talking about. And At-Tabari, because of, of course, it's Jami' al-Bayan, he compiles, he collects all the possible meanings that can exist. And this is something really important for us, I think, as modern Muslims, to recognize the textual policy of the fact that the Mufassirin understood the Quran to have a possibility of meanings. They did not say, that this is all it could possibly mean. So At-Tabari, even with this notion of men's degree, cites 5 possible meanings. And then he says, but I believe Ibn Abbas's opinion to be the correct one, the dominant one. What's really interesting is that you have many mufassirin after At-Tabari who are engaging with his work, but do not cite this opinion. Do not cite this opinion. In fact, some of them, one of the ways in which we also find some patriarchal, you can say, ideas seeping into the tafsir tradition is when they try to explain why. And this is something that Karen Bauer also finds in her work, Gender Hierarchy in the Quran. She says around the 6th, 12th century, and I find that to also be accurate in my own kind of short chronological study. I mean, I only looked at like 7 medieval mufassirin. But there was this development in the genre to try to explain, well, why were men given a degree over women, or why are men qawamun? And when you get into this why, you're sort of veering away from the established methods that the mufassir himself has established, and instead kind of going into the subjective area where they start to retroactively say, oh, well, there's these certain legal privileges men have, or there's certain biological features that men have, like the beard or whatever it may be, and projecting this as, well, this is why, right? And this development into why, I think I found, as well as Karen Bauer mentions this, kind of pushes some mufassirin into more of a subjective analysis, specifically when it comes, I think, to women, the question of women.
But see, my only kind of issue with that is we would be guilty of the same charge if we looked at a verse of the Quran and based on our own understandings of culture, of life, of masculinity, of femininity, of the desirability of egalitarianism, etc., we would also try to reconcile the verse with our understanding of the morally good. I mean, that's what, and I understand that my own understanding of the morally good is also yahtamil al-khat. It could be right or it could be wrong. But what I'm attempting to do is to make wahi operational, in my life. And sometimes I find that when we're thinking about medieval exegetes, it's very easy for us to see some of the impoverishment in their subjectivities. Like, I don't really, we can see where those subjectivities don't resonate with us. But one of the things I try to stop short of doing is recognizing that, well, without some generalizations about love or marriage or masculinity or femininity or male responsibilities, female responsibilities, I think without some of those generalizations, which will inevitably end up based on subjective understandings, how would the Quran be intelligible? So I like comparing those classical tafsir with contemporary tafsir in order to give our thinkers license to think about these things on the basis of their own subjectivities. I think sometimes when we read into the subjectivities of medieval scholars, this kind of moral, or I would say immoral, I'm not saying you're doing that, but I'm not saying you're doing that. I think, but this kind of, we see some of the moral problems in their subjectivities. I don't know. I worry that we're guilty of a little temple centrism, right? That we think that it's there's something reprehensible about this reading because it doesn't conform to my kind of understanding of what is normative, right?
Yeah. No, yeah.
Is it? I guess I'm saying, is it enough to say that, okay, in order for me to make the Quran make sense, there would be no way for me to take that tafsir seriously? So, like, look at what you said, like about verse 434, right? وَضْرِبُوهُنْ. There's great debate about this. But I've taught many classes, and inevitably, this ayah comes up. Interpretations of this ayah come up. And when I say to people, well, you do realize no matter who you are, if you believe the Quran is from Allah, if you don't believe the Quran is from Allah, it is undeniable that this ayah is actually talking about Islah, is talking about rectifying the problems in the marriage. However whether you understand وَضْرِبُوهُنْ to mean to leave, whether you mean it to be like ضرب الكتف, to grab something, whether you believe it to refer to some kind of corporal rectification, or it is, right, it is mentioned in the context of Islah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I know myself that given how my wife and I relate to each other, that there would be no possibility of Islah whatsoever with any kind of unwanted physical touching. That in my context, the possibility of marital harmony would be precluded by way of any kind of unwanted physical touching.
Yeah, yeah. So if you don't mind, oh sorry, did I cut you off?
No. I guess what I'm saying is, what's wrong with me imagining that maybe other people were speaking to a context in which it was presumed that whatever is intended in this ayah could lead to some kind of reconciliation, cessation of, marital difficulties. What, like, I don't understand, like, what's wrong with recognizing that? I'll give you one example of what I'm talking about, and I know that it's going to be controversial, and I'll let you respond.
Okay.
There's a book called Spare the Rod, right? And this author is arguing in a very compelling fashion that physical whippings, which are very popular in African American families with children, right? This is a remnant of slavery, right? This idea of physically disciplining children, whippings, spankings. And she makes a very compelling argument that we should not spank our children. We should not, there is nothing good that, and she has statistical data, she has field work, she's talked with people who were spanked, and she is her name is Stacy Patton. And my wife and I, we read the book, and we decided we are not going to spank our children, right? Which, is a lot different than how I grew up, right? It's a lot different than how I grew up. But we decided we're not going to do this. Now, my mother comes over, sees my children, let's just say a bit lax, right? And my mother will say to me candidly, Will, my given name is Will, whip those kids, right? Whip them. And when I tell her, Mama, we're kind of moving away from, the spanking, and we've decided that we won't do that, she just looks at me like, what? Because I realized that my mother is not telling me to demoralize my children. She's not telling me to destroy their confidence. She's not telling me to make them feel worthless. She actually doesn't believe that all of that will result from my spanking them. She actually doesn't believe that that's what's going to happen. Now, I, due to exposure, due to reading, due to talking with other parents, I've arrived to the place that I'm thinking, no, just the possibility that could happen, that my children could be demoralized, that they could lose self-confidence, that it is not the sunnah of Muhammad alayhi salam. I've decided I don't want to do that. But for me to look at my mother's insistence that I spank them and to say it's immoral, that it's somehow reflective of an ethic that minimizes the value of children, I think that's an I actually don't believe that. I think she has a subjectivity and I have a subjectivity, but mine is different than hers. And I have every right to follow the dictates of my own findings in this regard. But I don't say she's immoral, she doesn't value children, I don't, I mean, can you see the analogy that I'm trying to?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think if I can address the first part of your question first, in terms of our positionality, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. Like, it would be really, just to be explicit, hypocritical of us to think that medieval exegetes were influenced by their own historical, social, and cultural realities, and were somehow removed from our own. I mean, of course, we bring our own positionality to our understanding of the Quran. That's not to say that there are no universal divine truths that we can find across history, across time. Of course, it's a universal message, but it's always been understood by human beings within the context of their realities, and we cannot escape our own positionalities. And I talk about this both in my introduction and in my conclusion. In my introduction, in fact, maybe I can share the screen. Let's see. Does it allow me to share the screen? I'm not familiar with.
I think so. I think so.
Okay. So let me see. I think I can share this. Bismillah. And you can let me know if you see it. Do you see it?
No, I don't. Now I do. Yes, I do.
Oh,
I see it.
Okay. So, I talk about how, here, if, I'm going to just kind of see if I can. So I talk about how, and this is in my introduction, I mentioned again my conclusion, that the challenge for Muslims invested in locating the Quran's transcendent qualities is to untangle the relative and particular meanings from those that are universal and transcendent. Yet our ability to discern the universal is still predicated upon the particularities of our own context. And in accordance with Gadamer's theory of historically affected consciousness, we cannot escape our own place in history, although we can attempt to be conscious of it. Every finite present has its limitations. And I mentioned that I agree with Aisha Hidayatullah's argument that we often forget that our notions of equality are guided by historical values of our own that we bring to the text. And this is also an argument that Barlas has acknowledged. Even Amina Wadud in her second book talks about how her own reading is dwarfed by her context and history. And so I talked about here, one's reading of the exegetical tradition should therefore bear in mind that just as medieval exegetes' readings were sometimes influenced by their particular context, so are ours. And that is something I believe is very important to acknowledge, that like our own, space, like our own, our own context and how that's influencing even the questions we're asking of the Quran. I talk about how, I don't know if you had a chance to talk about the state of double consciousness that I mentioned, that I think was very much influenced by, the fact that I am a student of Dr. Sherman Jackson's. And I think, I kind of think about how, what am I investing with theoretical stock myself, and I talk about how, Muslims today have this sort of double consciousness that W.E.B. Du Bois described in the late 19th century. And, how, and I asked, how has this double consciousness influenced the very questions I explore? To whom am I speaking? And what interests will my scholarship primarily serve? And without asking these questions of myself, I risk the possibility of becoming entangled in the very structures of power that I critique. And so I strive, therefore, throughout the book to follow the evidence to where it leads, whether to dark alleys of misogyny or bright horizons of ethical hermeneutics, without assuming the posture of defensiveness or warrantless critique. And so I try to be conscious and aware of my own, positionality, if you will, as a Muslim American female, and the way that, decades of Western representations of Muslim women have sort of created this need to, defend myself, to defend Muslim women in general, like as if we speak for, 500 million people out there, right? And so to just kind of take stock of that. In terms of, if you want to get into, and I don't know if we're running out of time, but
we have a few more minutes. I guess I'm looking for, I have some ghaira when it comes to the turath. Not the kind of a ghaira that, urges me to insulate the turath from any critique. I mean, I studied at Azhar. I read things in classical books of Islamic scholarship that were misogynistic. I read things that were racist. I read things that, were classist. I read things that were just yellow in terms of the political quietism, embodied in those approaches. But I guess the way that I learned to read those books, learned to read those statements, was trying to understand them in the context of people trying to be moral, right? But being limited by their own positionality. Right?
Absolutely.
And I think that, when I understood it that way, I could see more redeeming qualities within the Turath.
Yes.
Right? I could see more like, okay, this is definitely evincing a different understanding of beauty, for instance, than I have. Like, I've read things about, the Prophet alayhi wasalam standing with Aisha radiallahu anha and Abdullah ibn Maktoum. Of course, Abdullah ibn Maktoum radiallahu anhu is a blind man. But there conversing with him, the Prophet ﷺ gestures to Aisha to go around the partition, the hijab, the curtain. And she responds, Ya Rasulullah, he's blind. He can't even see me. And the Prophet, and this is the hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, he says, are you blind? Meaning, but you can see him. So there's still this conscious observance of this kind of adab, right? But in the next chapter, Aisha is watching the Abyssinians of Banu Arfidah, and they're doing these choreographed kind of dances, and the Prophet ﷺ is not telling her to, you can't look at them.
Yeah.
So Imam Bukhari entitles the chapter Jawaz an-Nadar ila al-Ahbashi wa man ashbahuhu. The permissibility of looking at Abyssinians and people like them. And I just asked my hadith teacher, like, straight, what does that mean? Right? And he said that what Bukhari is indicating is that there is something inherently less attractive about the Abyssinians. That Aisha looking at them is not the same as her looking at Abdullah ibn Maktoum. Right? Now, of course, I don't hold Africanity or blackness to be something ugly. I don't believe that.
Of course,
right?
Yeah.
Of course I don't.
Well,
but when my friend said to me, if you came into the house, and this, I know, forgive me for speaking so much during this interview. I'm so sorry.
No worries. No, of course.
I'm sorry. Yeah. But this was a strong point. He said, if you came into your home and you saw Asia, who was now 16, looking at like an action movie, and the stars, who were all Asian or something like that, right, were taking off their shirts and they were fighting, and you looked and you said, you walked past it, and then you saw her looking at some young pop stars that were like the heartthrobs of the day, and they were on the stage and they were taking off your shirt, and you reacted differently, and you said, no, right? And somebody was trying to understand the difference between why you covered the television when it was like Drake and somebody else, and when it was the action stars, you didn't cover the television. And they located that difference in the ethnicity of the performers. That because they were Asian and they were black, that was the source of the difference. Would it be safe to say that you think Asians are ugly? I said, no, because I don't believe that Asians are ugly. I don't believe anything like that. But there is a subjective difference in how I might react to those two scenarios. And what he was saying, my friend was saying, who was also a student in Azhar at the time, how do we look at a text, understand what Bukhari is doing there, understand that we're not limited to it. Like
Absolutely.
I don't view it that way,
Mhm.
right? But still see these texts and this tradition as having some redeeming moral value, that we don't say it's racist. It's
Absolutely.
racist, right?
Yeah.
They regard, Imam Bukhari regards Africanity as ugly and he's racist. This text is racist. Psst, forget it.
Mhm.
Right? Is there some other option? Is, I guess, what I'm leaning toward.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely, and this is the very reason why I'm engaging with the tafsir tradition, because I think it's been grossly misunderstood. And I try to kind of, in many ways, cull those critical interventions in which both medieval and modern mufassirin are pushing back against, dominant patriarchal interpretations of these four verses. There are many critical interventions that I talk about. So since you mentioned spanking, and the idea of physical or discipline, if you will, and there were two questions that came up that I missed, so hopefully we can get to them. But I will mention that I do talk about in chapter 5 on this idea. I say that really my reading of the tradition is that medieval mufassirin were not like simply comfortable with a straightforward interpretation of verse 434. um, and this is something that I think we need to kind of reckon with, that they, if you look closely at the classical tradition when it comes to 434, you also see these hermeneutical tensions and this conscientious wrestling, as described by some modern scholars, the way they're engaging with this verse.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the notion that classical scholars were unperturbed by the notion of a husband abusing his wife does not withstand a close historical inquiry. And so even, the traditional dominant position most of you are familiar with is that, there were several restrictive, it was interpreted in a restrictive way. At least three restrictive dimensions were added, one of which is like the nushuz has to be something that's ascertained, that the sequence of disciplinary measures have to be applied sequentially for a certain period of time. Third, that the darb is غير مبرح, that's non-injurious, does not leave a mark. But even among medieval exegetes, you find outliers to this dominant position, beginning with the 8th century Mufti Mekki, Meccan Mufti. I'm sorry, it's late. I've been doing a couple of talks today.
English, right? Muftiyun Makkiyun.
Meccan Mufti Ata ibn Abi Rabah, who says a husband gets angry with his wife but does not hit his wife, and that this state here is a state of karahiyah, not that this is an obligation, but the imperative here. And you have two mufassirin who adopt this position, who are quoting Ata ibn Abi Rabah, one of whom is the believe 11th century mufassir Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, Andalusian Maliki scholar, who actually says, and to your point, Ustadh Ubaydullah, that he says that a father and husband cannot discipline their wife or child without losing something of their own spirituality, that they are losing something of their own state by engaging in that. And so, he talks about not applying this at all. You have also in the early 13th century Fakhruddin al-Razi, who takes this position, and he is citing a Shafi'i who basically says وَتَرْكُهُ أَفْضَلُ, that it's superior to leave hitting altogether, based on the prophetic tradition وَلَنْ يَضْرِبَ خِيَارُكُمْ, that the best of you will never hit. And in the 20th century, you have Muhammad al-Tahir ibn Ashur, who is citing Ata ibn Abi Rabah again, as Ibn Arabi does, to argue that it's really hitting is a very dangerous matter. And Ibn Ashur's interpretation of this verse is quite interesting, because you see the sort of wrestling with what is this verse saying. He does posit an interpretation that I have not seen before, that perhaps the person or persons being addressed in this verse, al-mukhatab, are not the husbands, but wulat al-umur, he says, the legal authorities, because nushuz is a serious matter that should be elevated to the courts. And therefore, he says, if they are the mukhatab, of course, this is not absolute, but he says this is one possibility, because he quotes al-Zamakhshari in his interpretation of a different ayah in which the mukhatab of a verse can fluctuate. It can shift. And so he says that even if when it says وَهَجِرُوهُنَّ بِالْمَضَاجِعِ, of course, وَهَجِرُوهُنَّ is that
the mukhatab is the husbands in that.
Yes. And whereas possibly the other three steps would be, or the other two steps of the three would be for the legal authorities. And he talks about how it is very dangerous to allow a man to hit while he's venting his anger, and that this would very much, allow for I guess create a loophole. And he says that the legal authorities who find that a husband has abused his wife should punish that husband, to sort of send a message. But I wanted to just kind of clarify that this idea that this tradition is sort of, monolithic, it's all patriarchal, like you were saying, is just not true. And if we're to actually engage with this tradition, we find a spectrum of interpretation. One of my favorite, I will say, is Al-Qurtubi when it comes to وَلَهُنَّ مِثْلُ الَّذِي عَلَيْهِنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, who basically says men need to, be appealing to their wives, and they need to take care of themselves before approaching their wife, just like you want your wife to be, appeasing to you and look clean. And, he quotes, of course, Abdullah ibn Abbas. But then Al-Qurtubi goes out of his way to instruct men on how to look appealing, and how that they should use mustaches and use siwak, and if they are balding, they can use, all sorts of very specific, subhanallah, like information. My husband's also, Jeff Bezos look. I think they're all trying to.
No, I think that some people are frustrated by this process. Me, I think it's part and parcel, a part of trying to extract transcendence from a thoroughly historicized text and tradition. And I think that process, if one engages it earnestly. No, I didn't, son. I didn't, son. If one engages it earnestly, I think it will increase your love, for tradition. It will increase your appreciation for revelation. That, if I'm living in a context, and this is really my situation, I just could not imagine any Islah ever involved, like in my wildest imagine. If I'm talking about wildest imagination, I just could not imagine any marital dispute, conflict, difficulty being ameliorated by unwanted physical touching of any kind. I just couldn't. It's like, it would be like, that's an impossibility. That would never, there's no context in which I could think that such unwanted physical touching would result in anything besides the absolute breakdown of trust, respect, partnership, love. That is really my understanding of life. I understand that understanding of life is extraneous to the text of Revelation. How I then reconcile them is, I think is, that is what I imagine to be the challenge. Maybe you can take Faiza's question here.
Yes, and there were a few other questions, so I'm curious if there's a way to.
I don't know if I can pull the questions back up.
Yeah, is sister okay? So there's
this was the first question.
With the analogy of medieval mufassirin and their reflections on, say, the modern moon landing versus penetration of the heavens, or in Islamic law chapters on inheritance, many assumed girls don't inherit books because females are illiterate. Just be just as applicable to patriarchal assumptions in 434.
What do you do with that? What do you do with that?
Yeah, I'm not, the question is not totally clear to me, to be honest with you. But I understand. I mean, I understand some of the presumptions that he's alluding to. And you have Ibn Ashur, who I think engages this question in a very interesting way when he talks about mumathala in verse 228, وَلَهُنَّ مِثْلُ الَّذِي عَلَيْهِنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. And he talks about how this notion of mumathala in the Quran, this Quranic notion of mumathala between the genders, has not been upheld consistently by legal jurists. And he talks specifically about his own madhab as a Maliki, that the scholar that has allowed the minor female to be married off against her will has not upheld this mumathala with the son, and a few other instances he talks about. And so, he's willing to, Ibn Ashur is someone who I see very much offering a corrective to the tradition, engaging with the tradition itself and trying to revive its principles and methodologies in this context of sort of, with Salafism kind of coming to the rise during this period in which he's writing. Also with the fact that tafsir bil-ra'i, as he tries to kind of correct misunderstanding of what that phrase means. So he tries to revive this notion of tafsir bil-ra'i and saying that tafsir bil-ma'thur is actually really a tafsir bil-ra'i, because those early authorities were also opining in interpretation based on their understanding.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So I think so he's engaging with the tradition while also providing a corrective. So I think that's how I would answer that question. Can we, if you don't mind, go to the next question really quickly, and so we can get to the last one. Okay, so in times where notions of, can you read the last sentence, because my thing is covering.
So in times where notions of justice change, what happens to Quranic interpretation when you want to uphold the integrity of Quranic guidelines and also the spirit of justice? This is an excellent question.
That's a really good question. Yeah, absolutely. I think, so gender, and then I think similarly, wouldn't acknowledging and incorporating one's own positionality be a requisite in terms of tafsir and application? I mean, one of the things I talk about is the way our milieu affects, the priorities we bring to our reading, right? Not necessarily, even just tafsir, but, so for example, you have in certain medieval periods, mufassirin delving into deeply philological questions or deeply legal questions or theological ones, which reflect a certain, and they weren't really interested in the gender question like we are today, which again is a circumstance of their intellectual milieu. And I think we need to understand Quranic commentators as human beings who are engaging with many things, not just with the Quranic text. The masail that they bring forth, the issues they bring forth are also a function of what is important at that time, right? And what are the debates that are happening. So for example, when you're looking at the modern mufassirin, whether it's Muhammad Abdo's Tafsir Manar, Abdul Rashid Rida's Tafsir Manar, or Sayyid Qutb's Fi Dhilal al-Quran, or Ibn Ashur's At-Tahrir wa Tanwir, you see that the intellectual priorities have changed. Yet I would argue that there are certain inherent things that we understand across space and across time, and that these are the values that we need to try to hold on to, if you will. And so, of course, medieval mufassirin were very much attuned to notions of justice, just as we are today. And that clearly comes through in their tafsir, not just of these ayat. I recently finished a short book chapter that will come out in another book on their tafsir of 4:4, for example, about the financial autonomy and the fact that women deserve a meher because it's recognizing the value of women. And in fact, what I noticed is that for the mufassirin, their tafsir of this ayah on meher was remarkably free of any mention that this was sort of an exchange, that women were, that they were receiving this meher in exchange for their, offering their.
But I do think, see, like the issue of mahar, very interesting to me. Of course, you're looking at the tafsir tradition. I'm much more familiar with the shari'i tradition. mahar does speak to an inherent inequality. Because, of course, my wife isn't giving me a mahar, even though we're both entering the marriage with responsibilities, but I'm responsible for giving her a mahar, right? Which speaks to not any kind of, I don't think there's an inherent implication of hierarchy that anybody's up, down, but something is different, right? When you look at something like mahar, something is different. When you look at something, going back to the earlier question, like even like about inheritance, I find it's a conundrum because many of my students, they say, why would I inherit less when I have all of the same financial responsibility? And I say, wait a second. And if you don't want to answer, you don't have to. But I'm asking you just because I want to really understand this. You mean to tell me you really completely share the financial responsibility of, the family with your husband? They look at me like, heck no. I said, well, there are certain aspects of this inequality that even as a very progressive, very evolved, very modern Muslim community, we still adhere to very strongly. So I know very many people that they want to inherit, equal to their male siblings, and they don't want to pay any bills in their household at the same time. And I'm thinking that's a conundrum. How do we what am I seeing there? I'm not exactly clear, but I recognize that it's a mishmash of different notions of justice.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think what you point out is that we can't look at legal rulings selectively. We have to look at the Islamic legal system holistically, right? And so this inheritance in the specific case when a biological sister and biological brother are inheriting from their biological father, so a full brother and full sister, that is one of the very few cases in which the sister just gets half, right? But there are other situations in which a man and woman will get the same, or a woman can get more than a man, depending on her relationship to the deceased. But in that very specific scenario, I think it's important to acknowledge that if you were to apply this system holistically, it could potentially offset itself, if not even more. If the husband and the men in the family, including the brothers, are you really applying what it means to be qawamun and financially providing for not just their wives, but the women, the single women in their family, whether it's a widowed sister or whatever the case might be, a widowed mother, that these what you call inequalities could offset themselves. Furthermore, this is where meher plays a role, right? That the woman is receiving the meher, whereas the husband is the wife is receiving the meher, the husband is paying a meher. And historically, what historians like Judith Tucker and Yusuf Rappaport have shown is that the meher was a substantive amount of money, historically speaking, where a wife could actually pay or buy a property or land with that dower. And so I do want to point out that in many cultures today, they have what's called an advanced dower and a deferred dower, but that dower is still a debt that the husband owes his wife. Whether he pays it in his lifetime or not, if he doesn't, it is the first thing that has to be paid off. It's considered a dain when he passes away, before any of the inheritance could be divvied up among the heirs. I believe we lost Ustadh Ubaydullah Evans, and in the interest of time, I think we should conclude. So I don't know if Ustadha Aisha is still on, if maybe you would like to jump on and to conclude.
Yes, I'm still here. I think we may have lost him again. Did you have any just final closing points that you wanted to make before we ended?
Was Faiza's the last question? Just to clarify, I'm sure I got all the questions. Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us today. I hope you, get a chance to buy the book. It's on Amazon. It's also on Oxford University Press's website. I would be very interested in your feedback and your questions. And of course, your feedback is very meaningful to me. You can reach me at my email address, which is mubarak@queens.edu. Jazakallahu khairan. Thank you for joining us today. Wassalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Are we offline now?
Not yet. I'll just let everyone know they can join the book club next week, and then I'll head offline.
Okay, sorry about that.
No problem. Okay. Thank you all for joining us for this discussion this evening. Inshallah, next week we'll be reading and discussing Dr. Hadia Mubarak's book during the ALIM Book Club. You can visit alimprogram.org/book-club, and you can join that discussion on Rebellious Wives Neglectful Husbands, which Ustadh Ubaydullah also will be joining, inshallah. And make sure to purchase Dr. Hadia's book, inshallah, and leave her feedback. Thank you for joining us. Assalamu alaikum.